Good afternoon. If I can get through this without losing the having the film stop, this should be your last lecture, and I will do my best to hit some of the highlights of Volume 1 of The Story of the Stone, although this is one of those books that I could talk about forever. And in fact, even just a couple of lectures may be enough for you. However, while I should make clear that while the Chinese definitely regard The Journey to the West, Monkey, as their favorite book, and many of you have enjoyed Monkey more than anything else in the course, and you're in most excellent company, The Story of the Stone, better known as The Dream of the Red Chamber, is China's greatest book. And I don't usually give you a value judgment about the things that we've read, but as I mentioned to you, having been working on this for about 35 or 40 years, I still am hopelessly in love with The Story of the Stone. Now, last time I talked about how if you were really spiritually aware, you could understand everything you needed to know from Chapter 1. There are a couple of different opportunities for you to reach enlightenment. The first one is when Vanitas reads The Story of the Stone, and he then reaches enlightenment and actually converts to Buddhism, and then, of course, changes the title of the story to The Tale of Brother Amor. Your second chance for enlightenment is not a Buddhist enlightenment. It is a Taoist enlightenment. And like The Journey to the West, but much more explicitly, the narrative of The Story of the Stone, although Bao Yu follows a Buddhist path out of illusion into enlightenment, there are all the other paths, and certainly Confucianism and Taoism, are by no means neglected and by no means treated in a pejorative manner. Poor Zheng Shirin, Mr. Truth Lies Hidden, at the end of Chapter 1, he has lost his daughter, having sent her out with a servant at the Lantern Festival. The servant is very appropriately, allegorically called Calamity. Don't hire a babysitter with that name if you can avoid it. He's lost his daughter. His house is burned down. He's been forced to go live with his father-in-law. His father-in-law cheats him. Life is really a misery for him. And then he encounters a Taoist. And the Taoist is singing a song. Now, if you ask yourself, is this the same Taoist talking to the Buddhist at the beginning of the chapter? The answer is yes. The Taoist and the Buddhist, Misterioso and Impervioso, they act as kind of fairy godmothers to the whole book, and especially to Bao Yu. They are pretty much interchangeable when it comes to intervening in a spiritual crisis. This reflects in part that at this stage of Chinese culture, Taoism and Buddhism, at least on the popular level, are practiced in very much the same way. So, sorry about this. This may be my last encounter with this photo booth thing. Never mind. He's come pretty much to the end of his rope, and he catches sight of the Taoist with the limp. The way you can tell the Taoist from the Buddhist is that the Buddhist's head is bald because Buddhist monks shave their heads, and I think it's also referred to as scabby sometimes. And the Taoist has lots of hair and a limp. That's the difference. That's how you check them out. And they, the Taoist is chanting a poem. Men all know that salvation should be won, but with ambition won't have done, have done. Where are the famous ones of days gone by? In grassy graves they lie now, every one. Men all know that salvation should be won, but with their riches won't have done, have done. But with their every day they grumble they've not made enough, but when they've enough, it's good night, everyone. Men all know that salvation should be won, but with their loving wives they won't have done. The darlings every day protest their love, but once you're dead, they're off with another one. Men all know salvation should be won, yet with their children won't have done, have done. Yet though of parents fond, there is no lack. Of grateful children saw I near a one. Shirin approached the Taoist and questioned him. What is all this you are saying? All I can make out is a lot of one and done. And in Chinese, it's hao and liao, so the rhymes are very amusing. If you can make out one and done, replied the Taoist with a smile, you may be said to have understood. For in all the affairs of this world, what is one is done, and what is done is won. For whoever has not yet done has not yet won, and in order to have won, one must first have done. I shall call my song the One Done Song. It's really one of the translator's best moments. Shirin had always been quick-witted, and on hearing these words a flash of understanding had illuminated his mind. He therefore smiled back at the Taoist. Wait a minute, how would you like me to provide your One Done Song with a commentary? And he does. This is page 63, 64, 65. And he provides a wonderful commentary showing that he has understood the emptiness of existence with a very Confucian bent. And it ends up as, in such commotion does the world's theater rage, as each one leaves, another takes the stage. In vain we roam. Each in the end must call a strange land home. Each of us with that poor girl may compare, who sews a wedding gown for another bride to wear. And the mad lame Taoist claps his hands, a very accurate commentary. But Shirin merely snatched the satchel that hung from the other's shoulder and slung it from his own, and with a shout of, "Let's go!" and without even waiting to call back home, he strode off into the wide world in the company of the madman. So, that is enlightenment. And as a matter of fact, if you're interested in how poetry can be a vehicle for enlightenment, the last chapter of my book, called Ideal and Actual in the Story of the Stone, is about how poetry is a vehicle for enlightenment. And this is not the only time in this book that a poem causes a feeling of enlightenment from one of the characters. And now, okay, so this is the mystical part, and then you're plunged into the narrative, and how does the narrative work, and who are all these people? Well, the Jia family has a status, and the Wang family, with whom they are so intricately intermarried, they have the money. And this becomes a domestic drama. And if you study Chinese sociology at all, or just, traditional family ethics, the actual patterns of this family violate almost every one of the ideal patterns of Confucian society. In other words, in an ideal family situation, the husband, of course, is the head of household, and when the husband dies, the mother is then supposed to be subject to her son's authority. But of course, in this family, grandmother Jia is not subject to anybody's authority, and she and her granddaughter-in-law, Wang Shifeng, basically run the place with almost no input from the men, and in fact, the men don't have any idea of what's going on. Part of this is because Bao Yu's father, Jia Zheng, is a dismal failure at a public office he inherited. He is overwhelmed with the work. His job keeps him away from home, and this leaves the women in charge. And then into this world comes Bao Yu, and this is one way of explaining the jade. A common figure in Chinese literature portrays someone who is spiritually aware as being born with a piece of jade in his mouth. It doesn't mean that he's born with a silver spoon in his mouth. It doesn't mean that he's born to rank and privilege. It means that he is almost supernally spiritually aware. But we know, that the jade is either the reincarnation or the manifestation of the stone from chapter 1. We know now that it means that the boy will be spiritually aware, but it's not understood that way in by most people. And it puts Bao Yu under a lot of pressure because most people interpret this as a sign that Bao Yu is going to be born to the kind of Confucian success, taking the exams, getting a good position, and therefore bringing the family fortunes back up, rather than being someone who's really, really going to understand people, especially females. Bao Yu's not always crazy about this jade because he doesn't need to have the jade around his neck to be overwhelmed by attention. He is utterly gorgeous. He and Genji have this in common. He is the only son left in the family who looks like he has any talent or intelligence for learning and therefore taking the exams and following, etc., etc., etc. That kind of worldly success. Plus, no one else has a son to carry on the family name. So it's a lot of pressure. And so he's not always crazy about his jade, and as he becomes more and more enmeshed in the world of attachment, it gets mistaken as a symbol of other things. And I hope that you didn't miss this on page 104. Dai Yu, who is, of course, the reincarnation of the crimson pearl flower, has arrived at the mansion. This is in chapter 3, and has been introduced to Bao Yu. Now, the two of them have this feeling of déjà vu when they see each other. And Dai Yu finds him very, very familiar, and Bao Yu actually says, I have seen this cousin before. And of course, in this incarnation, they have it. This is what my colleague Hal Roth refers to as a karmic jog. I love the phrase. A karmic jog is when you have a feeling of déjà vu, but the substance of that feeling is from a previous incarnation to which you have, as you know, no conscious access. Whoops. Please go away, iTunes. Sorry. I have no control over my screen. Okay, that should go. Here we are. All right. And so they feel this spontaneous affinity, this zhiji, if you like, this sort of immediately they somehow know that this person is their intended soulmate, if you like, although there's no romance yet. And so in order, remember, Baoyu's only about 10 years old at this point. Okay, Dayu's maybe 9. They're quite little. Trying to establish why they might have such an affinity, Baoyu asks Dayu, "Have you got a jade?" The rest of the company were puzzled, but Dayu at once divined that he was asking her if she too had a jade like the one he was born with. "No," said Dayu, "that jade of yours is a very rare object. You can't expect everybody to have one." This sent Baoyu off instantly into one of his mad fits. Snatching the jade from his neck, he hurled it violently on the floor as if to smash it and began abusing it passionately. "Rare object! What's so lucky about a stone that can't even tell which people are better than others? Beastly thing! I don't want it!" The maids all seemed terrified and rushed forward to pick it up, while Grandmother Jia clung to Baoyu in alarm. "Naughty, naughty boy! Shout at someone or strike them if you like when you are in a nasty temper. But why go smashing that precious thing that your very life depends on?" And, because of the mistaken notion of the symbolism of the jade, Grandmother Jia is really talking about the fate of the family. "None of the girls has got one," says Baoyu, his face streaming with tears and sobbing hysterically. "Only I have got one. It always upsets me. And now this new cousin comes here as beautiful as an angel, and she hasn't got one either, so I know it can't be any good." Great favorite passage of mine. In part because when I was working on attention deficit disorder in the story of the stone, this was one of those episodes that was clinically very suggestive. Okay, so Grandmother Jia soothes him down. He puts the jade back on again. But, and from that point, he and Dayu are constant companions. But it gives you that passage, I mean, this is before Freud, but that passage has been interpreted again and again as a sign of Baoyu's obsession with his sexuality. And this, in turn, has led to misunderstandings about the significance of Chapter 5, from which the title in English, The Dream of the Red Chamber, which is essentially a misnomer, is derived. Okay, so let's go to Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is, the title of Chapter 5 is Jia Baoyu Visits the Land of Illusion and the Fairy Disenchantment Performs the Dream of Golden Days. And that is the title that is translated as A Dream of Golden Days, is in fact where the title Hong Lo Meng comes from. And Hong is red, Lo is, usually an outbuilding in a garden, but can also refer to, in this case, the red walls that would have been the color the wealthy people would have painted their outside walls with. The redness, red is the auspicious color in China, and Hawkes very sensibly could not really follow that and get across the happiness of the concept. So in many cases he talks about, in this case he translates it as the golden days. The idea is that Hong Lo Meng, means dream. So this is the dream of the Hong Lo, of the red chamber. A lo is not a chamber, it's some kind of a building. But the idea is that if you have red buildings or red paint, that is a sign of being wealthy, prosperous, and so forth. And therefore, the dream of the red however you want to translate buildings, really refers to the good old days. In other words, the dream of the days when we lived as wealthy members of the Chinese gentry. But try putting that on a book and calling that a title. Anyway, chapter 5 is very important, both for the foreshadowings of the fate of the girls he loves so much and for the turning point in Baoyu's sexual awareness. There's no question that sex is involved. So Baoyu has been at a party at the neighboring mansion and has gotten sleepy and he has been invited by his niece. Technically, she's his niece because she's a generation below him, even though she's older than he is, to come and have a nap. And when she brings him to her husband's study, and he does not want to have his nap there. And so she says, well, what am I going to do with you then, unless you'd rather have your nap in my bedroom? And that is definitely Baoyu's idea of a great idea. And the maids all object because, technically speaking, it's inappropriate. It's symbolic incest. An uncle sleep in the bedroom of his nephew's wife. Who ever heard of such a thing? And then think of all the novels you know. The Tin Drum by Günter Grass comes to mind, where the assumption that somebody is just a little boy and can't do any harm is essential. She says, he won't misbehave. Good gracious, he's only a little boy. We don't have to worry about that sort of things yet. But of course, he is right on the cusp of puberty. It's just that nobody realizes that. Whoever realizes that? So she brings him to her utterly gorgeous bedroom, and the description is completely hyperbolic. Inside the room, there was a painting by Tang Yin, one of the Ming Dynasty's most famous painters, entitled Spring Slumber, depicting a beautiful woman asleep under a crabapple tree whose buds had not yet opened. Excuse me. The painting was flanked on either side by a pair of calligraphic scrolls, blah, blah, blah. On a table stood an antique mirror that had once graced the tiring room of the lascivious Empress Wu Zetian. Wu Zetian was a figure in the Tang Dynasty who was actually the only woman in all of Chinese history who ruled in her own right and her own name. Beside it stood the golden platter on which Flying Swallow once danced for her emperor's delight, and so on and so forth. So the whole thing is, the priceless bed, the canopy of pearls, the so on and so forth. These are all figures out of Chinese history and mythology. And Baoyu says, I like it here. And she replies that my room is fit for an immortal to sleep in. And so in this beautiful room, filled with all these suggestive objects. Now, I don't mean to agree that the objects in the room actually belong to the Empress Wu Zetian or the Princess Shouyang or whoever they're supposed to have belonged to. Baoyu is a very smart boy. He's read a lot, even though he doesn't like to study, and his head is full of romantic notions of women he's read about in books. And so this can be interpreted as when Baoyu comes into this inner sanctum of marriage. I mean, here he is, a boy on the cusp of puberty. He's going into a bedroom of his young niece and nephew. This is where they do it, whatever it is. And so he would see all of these objects, the bed, the things on the vanity, and so forth and so on, in terms of what he had read in books. It's kind of wonderful if you think about it, because I suspect we've all done this, however far in the rearview mirror it is. And it's one of the examples of how Cao Shi really understands how other people, how people think, and can get into their minds and have the reader see it in that way. Okay, so he falls into a dream, and in his dream he meets the fairy Disenchantment, who says that she has come to look for him, and this is not an accidental meeting, and she invites him to her place. And on the way, he actually does take a look at some of the registers which foretell the fates of people on Earth, specifically the women in his household. By the way, do not miss the appendix, which explains everything that's going on in Chapter 5. It's a great appendix, and believe me, even Chinese readers have a great deal of difficulty with it. There's lots and lots of puns. There's also a wonderful glossary in the back with everyone's name, and a couple of family trees so that you can find out who's related to whom. Okay. So he looks at the registers. He doesn't get it. Then he listens to the beautiful pageant, The Dream of Golden Days, which in fact goes over precisely the same material that he saw in the register. And he actually just gets kind of sleepy. Disenchantment observed with a sigh that Bao Yu is dreadfully bored. Silly boy, you still don't understand, do you? And he says that his head is spinning, he's had too much wine, and so she brings him to a dainty bedroom, very much like the bedroom he's having his nap in now. And to his intense surprise, there was a fairy girl sitting in the middle of it. Her rose-fresh beauty reminded him strongly of Bao Chai, but there was something about her of Dai Yu's delicate charm. As he was pondering the meaning of this apparition, he suddenly became aware that Disenchantment was addressing him. In the rich and noble households of your mortal world, too many of those bowers and boudoirs, where innocent tenderness and sweet girlish fantasy should reign, are injuriously defiled by coarse young voluptuaries and loose, wanton girls. And what is even more detestable, there are always any number of worthless philanderers to protest that it is woman's beauty alone that inspires them, or loving feelings alone, unsullied by any taint of lust. They lie in their teeth. To be moved by a woman's beauty is itself a kind of lust. To experience loving feelings is even more assuredly a kind of lust. Every act of love, every carnal congress of the sexes is brought about precisely because sensual delight in beauty has kindled the feelings of love. The reason I like you so much is because you are full of lust. You are the most lustful person I have ever known in the whole world. He's 10. I mean, just put yourself in his position. And in fact, he is scared. And he says, Madam Fairy, you are wrong. Because I am lazy over my lessons and mother and father still have to scold me quite often. But surely that doesn't make me lustful. I'm still too young to know what they do, the people they use that word about. And then she explains to him, you know, the usual interpretation of the word lust. And the usual interpretation, as you might expect, is such a person is a mere brute. His is a shallow, promiscuous kind of lust. And then she says, but your kind of lust is different. That blind, defenseless love with which nature has filled your being is what we call here lust of the mind. Lust of the mind cannot be explained in words, nor if it could would you be able to grasp their meaning. Either you know what it means or you don't. Because of this lust of the mind, women will find you a kind and understanding friend, but in the eyes of the world, I am afraid it is going to make you seem unpractical and eccentric. It is going to earn you the jeers of many and the angry looks of many more. And so she has decided to shake the mystery, the foolish superstition and mystery and fantasy and so forth, out of love by giving him a bride who combines, incidentally, the attributes of the two girls he loves best, but has the name Ko Ching, which is, she's actually called 2-in-1. Of course, that's Dayun Bachai. But Ko Ching is the personal name of Qin Shi, in whose bedroom he is taking his nap. Well, they spend the night together, and in the morning, they go out to walk around, and Bao Yu falls into the ford of error. And, and disenchantment trying to keep him away from the edge. If you had gone on walking just now and had fallen in, all the good advice I was at such pains to give you would have been wasted. And then the dream ends, because the monsters come bubbling up from the ford of error, and he's dragged down, and he calls to be saved, and he wakes up. He wakes up, he's in the bed, the maids are all around him, and this is the greatest wet dream in world literature, just in case you are a little disappointed. The thing is that when Bao Yu complains that he's not really lustful, he's actually making the same mistake that the critics make. And Bao Yu's problem, it's like Genji's. Genji's problem is not really sex, it's susceptibility. It is his, unlike Genji, it is his feelings that are easily touched. But if you follow the text for the sake of his sexual career, you are going to find it very disappointingly restrained. And of course, the only thing he remembers from this dream is how to do it, and he coaxes his maid Aroma into helping him revisit the experience, and that would have been perfectly expected in Chinese culture. I'm afraid, let's see. Let me talk a little bit about the world of the garden. Prospect Garden is built because Bao Yu's older sister, Yuan Shun, it's all right, Bar. It's all right. Has been promoted to the imperial bedchamber. She has become an imperial concubine. Originally, she was offered for service in the palace. Bara, it's okay. They're just backing up. Yes, Bara. Bara, come here. Here's Bara. Bara. Yeah, show off. Come on. There we go. Okay, that's enough out of you. I didn't have a chance to bring her to the class. I would have. All right, so she is promoted to the Imperial Palace, and on the one hand, this is an absolutely unprecedented honor for anyone in the family. They, of course, do assume that this is a sign that the family is going to rake in unprecedented benefits, but it also creates some issues. This part is very much, this is chapter 17 on, chapter 17 and 18 especially. It is also replete with social satire and social criticism. Why? Because on the one hand, once a daughter had gone into imperial service, you would pretty much expect them never to be seen again at home. But this emperor, in his magnanimity and care for his subjects, realizes that this is a hardship for families who presumably are very fond of their daughters. So he has decreed that if anyone can create a separate residence which has the same level of security for the imperial concubines as the palace would have, that the girls will be allowed to go home and have a visit. Now, on the one hand, this seems like, oh, great, we can see our girls. All we have to do is set up a guest quarters. On the other hand, this business of the same level of security as the palace, that's very difficult. And on the other hand, it's a source of tremendous pressure on the families to spend a lot of money to get this privilege. And in fact, you see that very, very well detailed, because in order to provide a separate residence for the imperial concubine, the Jaws go ahead and build this unimaginably wonderful garden. And they combine all of their space from both residences. The fact that the Ningor house is willing to give up their all-sense garden to be combined into the prospect garden is actually fortuitous for that branch of the Jia family, because while you have to read the appendix to understand it, Qinshi, the guide to Baoyu's Wonderful Wet Dream, has been carrying on an incestuous affair with her father-in-law, and when she is discovered, she actually hangs herself in a garden pavilion. This is covered over in this version of the text by some kind of wasting gynecological problem. But in the original version, the unexpurgated version, if you like, Qinshi killed herself, and there was a tremendous effort to hush it up, and so on and so forth, for obvious reasons. the thing is that at one point, one of Cao Xueqin, the author's reader's relative, said that the hanging scene was just too painful and had to be taken out. They may have also thought that it was, for whatever reason, politically dangerous. There's a lot in this book that has been changed or edited because of potential political pitfalls. So Cao Xueqin did edit the prose part of the book to change her fate. But he never edited the poems. So the fate that you read of for Qinshi in chapter 5, that's how we know that originally she committed suicide. So the family has gone to great lengths to cover up what's happened and to have the whole thing dug up and reimagined. That's great for that branch of the family, for the Ningbo branch of the family. For the rest of the family, they're just so dazzled by the honor, and an unbelievable amount of money is being poured into this. Chinese culture has no myth of an original fall from grace, but this man-made paradise seems to bring up a lot of suggestive issues. The pattern of action about the garden's history is that the garden is gradually filled up with residents and with life, and then it's gradually emptied over the course of the novel as people from inside the garden are forced to leave and as people from outside actually invade it. So the garden provides one level of context and structure for the action of the novel. If you like, it's a second frame after the first frame, the land of the illusion, and the rock, and the flower, and Zhenshi Inn, and so on and so forth. There are let's see. We have in the chapters that you have read plenty of extreme emotional trauma. I'm sorry that I've had to skip over the episode of Jia, which is one of the most excruciating things I've ever read in fiction. It's appalling. He's a very unattractive character, but in the end you can't help but feel sorry for him. Bao Yu makes a real friend, Qinshi's brother Qin Zhong, but he is carried off by probably pneumonia, and so on and so forth. Let's take a look at Bao Yu's relationship with his father, which is one of the things that's brought out by the episode of the garden. Now, what about Jia Zheng? Well, he's usually dismissed as incompetent. He's assumed to be jealous and insensitive, but if you read carefully the episodes in which he interacts with Bao Yu and his mother, you will see that, in fact, he is a complicated figure, and sadly, no one in the text is sensitive to this. There's no doubt that he's incompetent at his job in the government. Okay, he's incompetent at running the household, but he is also acutely aware of his shortcomings and tends to deal with this painful awareness by ignoring the fact as much as possible, but when it bursts on him unprepared, it can unleash very extreme reactions. In chapter 17, Bao Yu is captured by Jia Zheng, when Jiazheng is to be taken on a tour of the finished garden. And he is followed by a sort of gaggle of what is referred to as literary gentlemen, you might say sort of his hangers-on. Even parasites have parasites, although Jiazheng is not a parasite. He's just not really very competent. And they're going to view the garden, but most importantly, they have to provide at least temporary names for all the buildings and couplets of poetry to go with them. Because, as he said, let's see. These inscriptions are going to be difficult. This is chapter 17, page 324. By rights, of course, Her Grace, that's the imperial concubine, should have the privilege of doing them herself, but she can scarcely be expected to make them up out of her head without having seen any of the views that they are supposed to describe. On the other hand, if we wait until she's already visited the garden before asking her, half the pleasure of the visit will be lost. All this prospect and pavilions, even the rocks and trees and flowers, will somehow seem incomplete without that touch of poetry which only the written word can give a scene. So that's Chinese custom. And off they go. And this is when they rope in Bao Yu. Bao Yu is really supposed to be very good at poetry, and in fact, in Jiazheng's eyes, that's the only thing he's good at. And therefore, there's enormous pressure on him to perform well. And in fact, the so-called literary gentlemen, Jiazheng's toadies and followers, they try to encourage Bao Yu. They want him to do well so that Jiazheng will be happy and pleased. It's part of the way of flattering Jiazheng, if his son does well, for them to make a fuss about how brilliant Bao Yu is. However, okay, so this is pressure on Bao Yu, no question. However, there's also pressure on Jiazheng, because if Bao Yu turns in a flabby performance, Jiazheng will be embarrassed, because he's supposed to have this brilliant son, and the boy born with the jade, and yada, 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 whatever that actually means. And so this is a father-son duel for the ages. So as you read through, so that's the purpose of this whole exercise. And as you walk through the garden with Jiazheng and the literary gentleman and Bao Yu, you have the pleasure of seeing it and how lovely it is, but you also see this tension. And Bao Yu, by and large, behaves as if he is terrified. But he can't help his adolescent arrogance bubbling up on certain occasions. For instance, here on page 336, Jiazheng sees there's all the different buildings in the garden have different symbolic meanings. There's a luxurious pavilion, and there's a quiet retreat in bamboos, and there's this pavilion on a hill, and there's that on the side of a beautiful pond. And at one point they get to what's basically an artificial farm, and Jiazheng says, well, how much do you like this place? And Bao Yu says, I don't like this nearly as much as one of the fancy ones. Okay. And his father snorted disgustedly, ignoramus, you have eyes only for painted halls and gaudy pavilions. the rubbishy trappings of wealth. What can you know of the beauty that lies in quietness and natural simplicity? This is a consequence of your failure to study properly. Your rebuke is, of course, justified, Father, Bayu replied promptly, but then I have never really understood what it was the ancients meant by natural. Okay, this is one of the most important concepts in Chinese culture. The literary gentlemen who had observed a vein of mulishness in Bayu which boded trouble were surprised by the seeming naivete of this reply. Why, fancy not knowing what natural means, you who have such a good understanding of so much else. Natural is that which is of nature, that is to say, that which is produced by nature as opposed to that which is produced by human artifice. Okay, you all got that? Perfect. But Bayu has a very good comeback. There you are, you see, said Bayu. A farm set down in the middle of a place like this is obviously the product of human artifice. There are no neighboring villages, no distant prospects of city walls. The mountain in the back does not belong to any system. There is no pagoda rising from some tree-hid monastery in the hills above. There is no bridge below leading to the nearby market town. It sticks up out of nowhere in total isolation from everything else. It isn't even a particularly remarkable view, not nearly so natural in either form or spirit as those other places we've seen. The bamboos in those other places may have been planted by human hand and the streams diverted out of their natural courses, but there was no appearance of artifice. That's why when the ancients used the term natural, I have my doubts about what they really meant. For example, at blah, 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 his body just melts down completely. Well, you know how adolescents go on and on and on when they think that they know everything. The literary gentlemen get him calmed down, and they continue the tour. Bayu is, when they come to the main building, Bayu suffers another karmic job. He sees the building and he has this overpowering sense of déjà vu. So, what can it be? Well, in this case, it is the palace of the fairy disenchantment from his dream in chapter 5. Of course, he has no way of accessing that now, and this is the most important building in the garden, and he really has to, at that point, give up. So, this is obviously a very important foreshadowing, illustration, and so on and so forth. And Jia comes across in this part as pretty much a sad stick. But if you go on to chapter 22 and read the episode about the lantern riddles, you will find that Jia is the only one to be affected by the grim portents, one after another, that the girls' riddles provide. They seem, again, to be foretelling their own sad fate. So this harkens back to chapter 5 again. And 448. Dayu especially, her riddle, the answer to her riddle is an incense clock which must consume its substance in order to perform its function. This is what Dayu will do as she cries to pay her debt of tears. In the case of Bao Chai, her riddle gets translated as a bamboo wife. What it is it's a special kind of wicker basket. It's not close woven, but you take it with you to bed in the summer to keep the sheets from sticking to you. So it makes like a little tent. However, well, here's the riddle. My eyes cannot see, and I'm hollow inside. When the lotuses surface in the middle of the summer, I'll be by your side. When the autumn leaves fall, I shall bid you adieu, for our marriage must end when the summer is through. Jia knew that the answer must be a bamboo wife, as they call those wickerwork cylinders that are put between the bedclothes in summertime to make them cooler. But a growing awareness that all the girls' verses contained images of grief and loss was by now so much affecting him that he felt quite unable to go on. Enough is enough, he thought. What can it be that makes these innocent young creatures all produce language that is so tragic and inauspicious? It is almost as if they were all destined to be unfortunate and short-lived and were unconsciously foretelling their destiny. So, Jia is a more interesting character than he's often given credit for being. The imperial concubine's visit is ridiculously short. She appears basically in the very late afternoon or early evening, and she has to go home like Cinderella before midnight. The visit is tremendous. It is full of interest for us, but quite frankly, it is, well, it's reflected in the answer to Yuan Chun's own riddle, which she sends to ask the children to she sends a riddle to the children so that they'll send their riddles back to her. At my coming, the devils turn pallid with wonder. My body's all folds, and my voice is like thunder. When alarmed by the sign of my thunderous crash, you look round. I have already turned into ash. And the answer is a firework. So this is, Yuan Chun's flashy rise, tremendous bang. And then, alas, she dies in the emperor's palace, childless, alone. This is, lacrimae rerum, the tears for the nature of things. Again, we have a Latin phrase for it. Not quite the same in China. Spoiler alert. In spite of everything, Dai is rejected by the Jias as a good bride for Bao Yu. It's not surprising. She's always ill, probably tuberculosis. See chapter 3 in Ideal and Actual in the Story of the Stone, where I also land the blockbuster analysis that Bao Yu's got terrible attention deficit disorder. And when she finishes the Debt of Tears, she dies at the precise moment that Bao Yu, who has lost his jade and lost his mind as well, marries Bao Chai. And then there are 20 more chapters to go. That's when Bao Yu will finally realize the emptiness of his family's aspirations, his romantic aspirations, and he's ready to leave the world. Chuzha means to leave the family, and Jinmen means to enter the gate of Buddhism as a Buddhist monk. Before he goes, though, he has 3 obligations. One, he needs to provide a male heir. 2, he needs to fulfill his promise to his grandmother to do the best he can for the family. And 3, he needs to show his respect and appreciation to his father. He fulfills them all. When he finally consummates his marriage with Bao Chai, in that one act of marital intercourse, he is able to impregnate his wife with a son. 2, to honor his grandmother, he pulls himself together to take the national exams, where he places a glorious 7. And 7 is also a mystical number in China, as it is practically everywhere else. Prime numbers, this is definitely the way to go. But when he finishes taking the exams, he disappears. So in spite of having achieved this extraordinary honor, which results in all sorts of wonderful things for the empire, as the emperor sends people to try to find him, realizes this is the brother of his concubine, of whom he was so fond, who died. So he proclaims a national amnesty. I mean, how many politicians can get a national amnesty declared? That's pretty good for somebody who just passed the exam, right? And he still has to show his respect for his father. So on a snowy night, Jia Zhang is returning to his home from Nanjing, where he has taken his grandmother Jia's coffin, and Dayu's coffin, and 2 other coffins. On a snowy night, Jia Zhang comes out onto the deck of his boat, and there are the Taoist, the Buddhist, Impervioso and Misterioso, and a young man with a bald head he doesn't recognize. And then he looks at him more carefully and realizes that it is his son. And Bao Yu bows to him 3 times and then disappears with the 2 immortals who brought him into the world in the first place. It is more than one other world. It's a great read. It has everything. High and low, shallow and deep, bright and grim, everything. So I hope that someday you will be able to enjoy it, and I thank you for your patience.